So this week we're going to look at how the family has changed over time. So one of the first things you have to understand are some historical trends to see why these changes may have happened in the first place. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the fact that people live a lot longer than they used to. Even going back to the Middle Ages, people lived to be about 30, 35 years old. That was considered old age. Children were married by 11 to 12 years old and having families and were middle aged by 20 and were old age by 30. Even in the mid 1800s, old age was 40, and 1 in 5 children died before the age of 5. Now, a lot of this changed because of changes to sanitation, in changes to medications and vaccinations and things like that, where we eliminated diseases and the causes of disease, and then we started to live longer. Also, with the discovery of new technologies to make work safer, people were able to live longer. Um, Treatments for diseases would save your life in war, for instance. Because if you got a cut, you would probably die of gangrene, even if the cut itself was not life threatening. Um, so today, more than 3/4 of Americans live to be at least 75. Another one of the big changes is that people are having fewer children than they used to. A typical white woman in the 1800s had 7 children in her lifetime, and today that number has fallen to 2. Now, one of the reasons that people had so many children is that they needed people to help do work around the house. So, most people were farmers. They had to have people to help tend the farm. They could not afford to hire someone to come out and work the farm, so they had kids. And as the kids got old enough to go out and do work with them, that's what they had them do. After changes where people started moving into the cities, children became expensive and they weren't a return on investment like they were before, so people started having fewer children because it was just too much to afford to raise them. Today, I think it takes $250,000 to raise a child from birth to 18. That doesn't include buying a car, that doesn't include paying for college. That's just the bare necessities, no extracurriculars to get that child to be an adult. A third change is that family members are now performing fewer functional tasks at home, and we're now relying more on the government or the market for many of these different functions that they used to take care of themselves. So, for instance, we now send our children to school. Now, we are either sending it to a government run public school or a market run private school. Another thing that has changed is that we go to restaurants now. Instead of preparing all of our food, so we're not raising the animals that we would be eating. We're not raising the crops that we would be eating and then preparing all of those into a food. We go and have someone else do it for us. Um, so as these different tasks have changed, there have been less need to have more and more family members living with you. So you can have fewer children, for instance, and you don't have to have your aunts, uncles, and cousins and everybody all living in one homestead, because now we've outsourced all of those tasks. The last change that we're going to talk about is that families have become more diverse. So, one of the family structures that most of you are probably familiar with is the idea of the nuclear family. 2 parents and 2 kids is typically how it's thought of. This has actually declined. And what we're seeing is a rise in cohabitation, a rise in people living alone, and a rise of single parent homes. So, all 4 of these historical trends have helped shape the modern family. So, the question is, why do we have families to begin with? Let's look at some definitions. So, back in the Roman Empire, family, familia, included everyone who was in that man's household. That included his wives, his children, his slaves, and his servants, right? We don't really necessarily consider that to be family anymore, as per your definitions when I asked you in the first week of class. But families still play a really important role in society. The biggest thing that they do is provide a transmission of norms. And what I mean by that is that it children are taught by their parents the way to act in society. They're taught that you shouldn't, run up and slap a police officer, probably, right? They're also serve a function of being a way to console each other during bad times and hard times, right? And on a more unequal scale, families are instrumental in the accumulation and maintenance of wealth and status of those at the top of the social hierarchy. So today, 80% of all wealth is inherited. That means only 20% of wealth is earned. This suggests that the majority of people in America are not going to go out and strike it rich, right? In fact, this generation that is coming up through college now is the first generation that they actually have worse outcomes for social mobility than their parents did. Whereas in the past, those born in, say, the 70s or the 60s, they had a much higher percentage chance of ending off better off, or at least the same as their parents. Now, children who are born in the 2000s and the late 90s, they're at the point where they are just going to be lucky to be at the same level and not end up worse than their parents. And when we talk about families and family lineages and this wealth and status, over time that's changed too. So in tribal cultures, the majority of tribal cultures that have existed in the past and those that we know for sure when we settled this country, were matrilineal. This means that it passed from the mother to the child, and it was the mother's lineage that was tracked and the most important. Most European cultures, however, are patrilineal. This means that everything is traced through the father's side. So, children have the father's last name, for instance. So to understand changes in family, we're going to look at family within two time periods. We're going to look at from colonialism to the 1800s, and then we're going to look at the early modern period of the 19th century and beyond. So in this first period, we have to consider three interrelated groups: African Americans, Native Americans, and white Europeans. When we talk about African Americans, we have to first understand that they are entwined with a history of violence that was created through slavery. These are people who were forcibly removed from their homes. They were then shipped across the ocean in huge cellars of a ship, auctioned off, and then forced to cohabit with peoples of diverse backgrounds, some of which couldn't even speak the same language. So they would take people, mix up the people from the different tribes. They may not be able to communicate with each other. They would throw them all together and expect them to all get along and work together and be good servants and slaves, right? But because of this, we will never know how much of their family patterns reflect those of their native lands. Because for the Africans, family itself was a victim of slavery. When we think about what happened to the African Americans, their children were ripped from their homes to be sold. Husbands and wives were separated. Some women took poison to prevent being separated from their children, and there are rumors that others poisoned their children to keep them from being sold into slavery. This is problematic for a lot of different reasons, and most of that is that there wasn't a strong sense of stable family allowed for the people who were enslaved in this country. And mainly because slave marriages were not recognized by the state. Families had no rights. They were denied the right to even having a last name. And this means it's impossible to trace or establish lineages. Whereas people of white cultures can say, oh yes, I'm Irish ethnicity or Scottish or Italian or German. Those of African descent can't tell you much more than that they're from Africa. And Africa is not a country, it's a continent filled with many countries. Okay. All of this being said, slaves did develop their own form of family. Now, this was often, as I said, not recognized by the state, but they formed familial clans. And if they lived in large plantations, they actually had more power because there were more people that they could organize and they could actually get their way a little bit more versus those that lived on the smaller plantations that usually had no power at all in keeping their families together. In the larger plantations, they may have had a little bit more opportunity to keep families together. Now we come to the Native Americans. Now, today, through what has been a very long and painful process, the descendants of these groups have been pretty much assimilated into white European culture. that started with ideas of things like manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was a religious ideology that said if God really wanted you to have something, you could take it. And if he didn't want you to have it, you wouldn't be able to take it from those you were trying to take it from. And they used this as an excuse to murder and kill and steal from all the Native Americans as they push westward across America. There's a great picture that shows Lady Liberty. She's stomping on the Native Americans as progress follows her across the western expanse. Now, when we look at how the families of the Native Americans differed, there were some similarities, but there were also some very strong differences between white cultures and the native cultures. But even among the tribes, there were some similarities. For instance, most of the tribes had very strong respect for their elders, and they relied on extended family networks, and almost all of them were matrilineal. In some ways, though, they were extremely similar to Europeans. For instance, monogamous marriage was common, as was divorce. So when we talk about divorce, divorce was typically frowned on by Europeans because they had at this point accepted that marriage is a religious sacrament. But among the Native Americans, divorce worked quite differently. In the 1893 short story A Red Girl's Reasoning by Paula Johnson, the author tells how a Native American girl who was humiliated by her white husband disappeared. When he finally tracked her down back with her tribe, he came up to her and was like, "Look, you're my wife, you're leaving with me." And she basically said, "No, I moved all of your stuff out of our house. We're divorced now." And that was actually a practice. So if a couple wanted to divorce, whoever wanted the divorce would take the other partner's things and put them outside of their teepee or hut or tent or whatever they were living in. And as far as the tribe was concerned, those two were no longer together. It's a much different practice than what we have today. When we look at colonial Americans, marriage was a practical arrangement. It was not a source of love or affection. Women in these relationships were a commodity. So in the very beginning of the founding of this country, in Jamestown, we see what we would call mail order brides. So when the men were becoming unruly, the King of England shipped over women by the boatload, and men traded 150 pounds of tobacco for a bride. So these women didn't really have a choice. They were sold to these men and then married to them in exchange for tobacco. After women did marry, they were totally dependent on their husbands. Women could not vote, hold office, serve on juries. Most could not own property. Most were not legally allowed to work in many areas. So women saw marriage as their only choice. But even in marriage, they're subservient. For instance, they would have to give to their husbands anything that he desired, and if he didn't like something that they did and he beat her, the authorities were most likely going to turn a blind eye. In fact, they were more likely to punish him for an out-of-control wife than they were for abuse. Now, once married, any property that a woman did own became the property of her husband. This included any fruit of her own labor that she did do. So if she was, say, a seamstress or she washed people's laundry, the money that she would make from those jobs would belong to her husband to use as he saw fit. In the 17 and 1800s, advice was given to women if their husband died to not ever remarry, so that they never lost the things that they had gained from their previous marriage. Now, as we shift into what we will call modernity, we start to see that marriage has changed. And one of the key things that changes marriage is democracy. So the rise of democracy was aided by the rise of industrialization. And people were able to break away from family traditions, go to the cities, get a career, and build their lives. Previously, a son would have to wait until his father died or left him an inheritance. Then he could get married and start his own family. Otherwise, he would have to wait. So men could be as old as 30, 35 years old before they get married. Under that system, because the father knew that if he passed the inheritance along too soon, the son may just kick him out and let him die, right? So he held on to his power for as long as he could, and this was called a patriarchal family. Now, the issue that came about was that the principles that are enshrined in the Declaration of Independence not only apply to nation states, but also to individuals. So people started to recognize that they had a right to pursue happiness, for instance. Now, the First World War didn't hurt this, and the Second World War certainly didn't either. And what this meant, all culminated into, is that more women began working outside of the home. This took a really big uptake following World War II, where the majority of men were shipped out to fight in Europe, and there were no people left here to work in the factories but women. So women started working in the factories and started doing those jobs. And what ended up happening was that when the men returned and women were suddenly told that, oh, you can go back and work at home, women said no. And they wanted to stay in the factories. And so we start seeing some different changes in relationships, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it led to the fact that women started owning property. Women started voting, and women started getting divorced. So as we'll talk about in the next set of slides, divorce became much more prevalent following World War I. But then the Great Depression hits, and World War II follows that immediately, and we see divorce decline quite a bit. Women, as they started going out and working in the workforce in the early 1900s and gained the right to vote, decided that they didn't have to get married if they didn't want to. But economic hardships forced couples to marry, or forced couples to remain married even if they wanted a divorce. And then after World War II, people were just so excited to see their loved ones return from war that marriage actually increased. Now, in the shift in modernity in the early 1900s, we start to see a change in courtship too. Now, as we move into the 1940s and 50s, power begins to shift from women to men. And what I mean by this is that in order to convince women to buy into the idea of marriage, women were allowed the idea of choice. They had the ability to choose, for the most part, who their partner was going to be. The parents would supervise, and the parents would make suggestions and allow certain people to come over. But in the end, the young woman decided which partner she was going to choose. But as the rise of the car happens, suddenly dates aren't taking place in your father's living room anymore. They're taking place at movie theaters and dinners and drive-ins and other places. And now the man can take her out of the house. He has control over what they do, where they go, how much sexual intimacy occurs on the date. But that's a big change. We actually see this idea of dating. It goes from courting to dating. We also see the rise of the public and private spheres. Now, the public sphere is the work environment, the government environment, and anything basically outside of the home. The private sphere is the home. Now, in order to convince people and women to go back to the home and stop working, we see the rise of the cult of true womanhood that said that a woman is a gatekeeper to her family's soul, and what she needs to do is to be at home and take care of the private sphere, right? And so this created this idea of the breadwinner, the male who goes to work and earns a living, while the homemaker, the wife, stays at home and takes care of the house. The problem is that this was a myth. The majority of people could never achieve this. Most women that were not rich had to work. And so it was only the upper classes that actually had this available to them. And the only way that this ever worked even for them was that the companies had to pay living family wages. A family wage means that it is a wage that covers a family of four completely. One person can work, and they make enough money to support a family of four. And I'm not talking about like a minimum wage. This family wage covered their mortgage, it covered a vacation or two a year, it covered a vehicle, and all the necessities, and allowed them to save $1 a week, right? So this is what, when we talk about the stagnation of the minimum wage in other classes, this is kind of what this is referring to. The original idea of the minimum wage was this idea, it was the minimum wage to support a family completely, right? So for men, getting married was great, right? Like in this photo here, me lift a finger, not anymore, get married today, right? This is the idea that he doesn't have to do anything ever again, just as long as he gets married. Advertisements kind of reiterate that very thought. Show her it's a man's world with Van Heusen ties, and it's a picture of her serving him breakfast in bed, right? There was a guide put out in the 1950s on how to be a good wife. It says, have dinner ready, plan ahead, even the night before, to have a delicious meal ready on time for his return. Take 15 minutes to rest so that you'll be refreshed, including touching up your makeup. Be happy to see him. Your goal to try to make your home a place of peace, order, and tranquility where your husband can renew himself in body and spirit. Don't complain if he's late home for dinner, or even if he stays out all night. Count this as minor compared to what he might have gone through during the day. Catering for his comfort will provide you with immense personal satisfaction. So this guide is actually the guide to the cult of true womanhood, that this is what a real woman would do for her husband. But advertisements continue to talk about what women should be and how they should be viewed in the family. So the harder a wife works, the cuter she looks. Gosh, honey, you seem to thrive on cooking, cleaning, and dusting. And she replies that she's able to do that because of her vitamins. And this is an advertisement for Kellogg's Pep, a cereal that's not sold anymore. Another advertisement said, remember to be a good wife. It's your fault if he cheats. If your wife can't cook, divorce her and keep her for a pet, right? Shh, mom's on the warpath. Why ruin the evening, mother? If your husband ever finds out you're not store testing for coffee, and then he's beating her. And then women were told to ask for appliances for Christmas. But how did they get through all this? How did they survive living a life where this was what they were expected to do, and that if they got upset about it, then they were on the warpath? Well, drugs. Most of the time, doctors would prescribe benzodiazepines, Valium, to women as a tranquilizer so that she could get through her day. Now she can cook breakfast again when you prescribe Mordentin. Reduce physical tension with Valium. Dr. Miles Nervine. At times I was a cranky wife, but then I took this and I'm happy. I adore my children. I also adore my pharmacist. When things go wrong, Miles Nervine helps calm you down. Her kind of pressures last all day. Shouldn't her tranquilizer? Now she can cope, thanks to Butasol. So women were expected to be medicated in order to accept this idea that they should be at home all the time, that they should sacrifice their own wants and desires in order to make him happy, and the only way they could do that is if they were drugged. In fact, Valium was called Mommy's Little Helper. If you've ever heard that term, that's what it actually comes from. And so it was advertised that way as a way to get women through their day. Something else that's kind of different today is the idea of marriage for love. So as we talked about in the colonial period, people married for practical economic arrangements, right? And that's pretty much been the history of marriage since the beginning of time. There was some kind of benefit to the marriage, whether it was economic or political. Somebody gained, okay? Starting in the early 1900s and late 1800s, you start seeing this idea that, oh, I shouldn't marry someone unless I love them, right? And a lot of this happened because of the changes in the workforce, but also because of the idea of labor-saving devices. Women no longer had to spend all day beating laundry against a rock in order to wash it. We had washing machines. We started to see dishwashers, refrigerators. A lot of these labor-saving devices started to allow women to have more free time. And during this, also, women began to seek their own independence through working. This meant that marriage began to be viewed as optional. But if it was ever truly optional, one had to be able to survive happily without being married. Now, the market and the state aided this, okay, in this view. So in conclusion, Marriages have changed over time. Now, they also differ by culture, as we talked about briefly with the African Americans and the Native Americans of this country. Marriage for love is a relatively new invention. In most cultures, it's been about economic gain or preserving and gaining status. The marriage that we know today is based on white European norms. It often favors monogamy or being married to one person instead of polygamy or the idea of multiple partners. In the cases in America where polygamy has been common, typically among like the Mormon cultures out west, those groups were very patriarchal, where the husband could have multiple wives. You didn't often see families where in America where the woman had multiple husbands.